Hi guys, my name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Center. The Nehru Center is the cultural wing of the Indian High Commission in the UK, and we've been in existence for many decades, and we organize wonderful events at this very auditorium, which is in Mayfair in central London. Sadly, as you can see, the auditorium is empty. It has been empty since we were all put into lockdown due to the coronavirus pandemic. But what we Indians believe is that the other side of a crisis is an opportunity. And what we have done at the Nehru Center is moved all our events online. So now if you attend our online events, every single seat is a VIP seat. Like you get a front row at our events. No trouble of parking, no trouble of traveling all the way. And most practically all the programs that we would do, like literary discussions and dance performances, musical performances, we are doing them all on our online channels. You can register for our newsletter at our website nehrucenter.org.uk. You don't need to write them down, they will be displayed at the bottom of the screen. You can also come to our Facebook page, which is a verified page, the Nehru Center. You can follow updates on all our events on Twitter as well, the Nehru Center, that's also a verified account. Or you can come to our YouTube channel, again, the Nehru Center. We are nothing if not consistent. I hope you do come to our online channels and enjoy the events that we are putting up for you. Thank you so much for all your love and support. Namaste, Jai Hind.
Good evening and good afternoon in Europe and in India. We are delighted on behalf of the Nehru Center, Amish Tripathi and his team, and of course all of us at ORF, to welcome you to this live discussion, India at 2030, Rise of a Rajasic Nation, a book edited by Gautam Chikermane, and a number of the authors who have contributed to this volume will be joining us for a discussion today. As we turn 74 in a couple of days, this volume, in fact, is an inspiration for many of us to rededicate ourselves and our purpose, and indeed our motivations to build a nation over the next decade. This is a challenge and an opportunity, and the pandemic gives us time to reflect and reset. To discuss India at 2030, and indeed the journey that India should take, is likely to make, and some of the decisions that we need to ponder over, we will be joined by a stellar star cast of contributors to this volume, including, of course, the editor Gautam Chikermane, Amish Tripathi, who you heard from earlier in this show. He's contributed a very important essay in this particular volume. Monika Halan, Amrita Narlikar, Bibek Debroy, and Manish Sabharwal. Now, while none of them need any introduction, when I turn to them during the conversation, I will briefly introduce their current affiliation in this conversation. So please join me in welcoming this wonderful starcast this evening, with whom we will discuss India 2030, the rise of a Rajasic nation. So with that, let me welcome all of them on stage as well. Gautam, welcome to Gautam Chikermane, Vice President ORF. Welcome to Amish Tripathi, who's managing the Nehru Center. Bibek Debroy, who is the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Council. Manish Sabharwal, who runs one of the niftiest firms, Team Leads, and we'll speak about some of those aspects. Amrita Narlikar, president of GIGA and a non-resident senior fellow at ORF. Monika Halan, who tells us how to save and how to make money grow. And of course, let me start with Gautam himself. And my first question goes to you, Gautam. Why did you make all of us write for you and put this volume together? What was your motivation? We are turning 74 in a couple of days. We are also in the third decade of the 21st century, and we are also in the midst of dark days. This volume is seen by many to be one of believers, one of optimists, one of those who think the opportunity lies ahead. What were your drivers of putting this wonderful volume together? I urge all our viewers online, all our viewers who will be watching the show later, to go and pick up this book, and please buy many copies and distribute it to your family and friends as well. This is an important collection, not because you will agree with it, but it will make you think. It will make you think about how you should approach the decade ahead. And Gautam, over to you. Your motivations, why this book?
Thanks, Samir. Thank you, Amish, for having us here. Nehru Center Observer Research Foundation. Thank you, my contributors, for taking the time out. And thank you, the audience who has taken time to listen to us. I'll cut straight to the chase. Samir, I think you've already answered the question in the question that you asked, which is that it is to make you think about where we are headed. You don't need to agree with it, but this is a definitive direction that India would be taking. So, why did I write this book? I think there are several reasons. First, of course, you know my obsession with numbers. The first reason is a number. We were approaching 2020, and I felt that it would be an interesting time to explore the new decade. As all who track my writings would know, this is something I do very routinely. For instance, my first book, a volume of poetry, was 5 Decades of Decay, which I wrote in 1997 on the 50th anniversary of India's independence. My fourth book was 70 Policies That Shaped India, which I wrote in 2017 on the 70th anniversary of India's independence. My next 2 books are based on numbers again. The 6th book is an economic history of the 30 years of economic reforms that began in 1991. And the 7th book is an edited volume on the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo. This book, my 5th, is part of the same thought process: a new decade, new hopes, new aspirations, and a new number. The second reason is that there was a dramatic change in the way India was perceiving itself. And all of us in this room would know, and you in particular, how we have begun to change the way we look at ourselves. I'm not talking about the narratives or the fake news that is dominating the discourse. I'm not talking about all that. I'm talking about real people, students, entrepreneurs, soldiers, leaders, the conviction with which reforms are happening today, the harsh pushback from the old entitled, the new laws that can change lives, and the old entrenched dynasts who are unable to or unwilling to take people along on this force. For instance, just last week, India got its 21st unicorn in 2021, upgrade. And we still have 4.5 months to go. I think India could end the year 2021 with about 25 to 30 unicorns, new unicorns. The third reason is, which I explored in one of the post-Pulwama essays, is the Rajasic spirit underlying these changes. Balakot was a defining statement of India that reverberated across the border as well as the world, outside as well as inside. It said one word: enough. And we have followed through with China at Galwan and now are pushing the boundaries of Quad, G20 and United Nations. But below all these was the changing spirit of the nation. Now, how do you negotiate this knowledge of the spirit or what is an ephemeral idea around spirituality? Something invisible, you can't see, you can't sense, you can't touch, and even sometimes often looked down upon by several of our own thought leaders, and use that knowledge to examine the country, the people, the changes. I found the answer in Sri Aurobindo, who several decades ago had analyzed this in the context of nations in his book, Bande Mataram. He said, nations, like individuals, have dominant characteristics. This can be tamasic or rajasic. There has been no sattvic nation so far, he writes. This dominant characteristic of the nation is an agglomeration of the dominant characteristic of its people, its leaders, its doers, thinkers, poets, builders, filmmakers, policymakers. From there, I reached Rishi Kapil and understood how these forces of Prakriti functioned within us. Finally, I took the 3 ideas: Kapila's Sankhya's philosophy, Sri Aurobindo's application to nations, and my own view of the world, and saw an intellectual opportunity in the number to put together a volume. That's how India 2030 was born. The 19 contributors needed no convincing. Most of them are people I have grown with over the past 3 decades, first as a journalist and now as a think tank. We have explored the rise of India together. We have been participants in that rise, but through different windows. Without exception, all, I repeat, all agreed to join this project in the very first conversation. I sensed that there was something there. I didn't need to convince anybody to say, to please write for us, etc. At the first go, they were resonating with the project. Then As all of you present here would know, I pushed the boundaries. I did not ask the contributors to analyze their sectors or in their areas of expertise. I asked them to forecast. I did not want prescriptive essays. We have enough of that in our daily lives as we track our developments of the day. I wanted predictive essays. That is, I wanted all my contributors to put all their knowledge, all their experience, all their articulation on the block. And to my surprise, again, all of them agreed. Finally, when I received the essays, I found that the essence of all resonated with the philosophical idea of the rise of India in general and expressed as a Rajasic nation in particular. None of them, by the way, has used the term or even hinted at it in their chapters. I must confess, therefore, this was a risky venture. But when I received these essays, I found resonance with the theme that had been bothering me, and hence this book. I need to make a small clarification here. The rise of a Rajasic India cannot be defined by data, even though data contributes to the theory. It cannot be hung on a person, even though people power it. That is, I must stress again, this is a hypothesis that attempts to use the tools of modern science and social science, including philosophy, to engage with the science of spirituality. In the 19 chapters, all you have looked at is change through data and anecdotes. I've simply put them together, tied them together into a single narrative, an Indian frame created and in India, created by Indians, but lost to us over the years. There is a sea of knowledge that drowns our ships of deeper expression. To understand what is happening in the world, in our countries, in our communities, organizations, families, we jump from logic to power to victimhood to social structures to virtues, values. I have attempted to provide a spiritual anchoring to these. The Sankhya principles, which Rishi Kapila had propounded or had put together, are real. You just need to engage with the science and reflect within. Once you do that, you cannot help notice how these forces are guiding our politics, our businesses, our intellectuals, our democracies, wars, peace. In a line, therefore, why I wrote this book was because I was compelled to by 4 ideas that were simmering and needed to get out as an intellectual catharsis. First, a number, 2020. Second, a series of analyses across fields by thought leaders like yourselves and other contributors. Third, the Sankhya philosophy of Rishi Kapil. And fourth, its application to nations by Sri Aurobindo. What I have done in this book is to take all these and apply them to a 21st century India and forecast what India in 2030 looks like.
Thank you, Gautam, and thanks a lot for that explanation. And I'm sure this will intrigue many of you to go and actually pick up this book and read it. I have read the essays, and I can tell you there are some really valuable insights. And perhaps some of those we are trying to tease out today in the discussion that follows. Gautam, I'm not going to let you off the hook. I'm going to come back to you at the end of the cycle, and I'm going to ask you about a very big event that happened recently, a big social media event. And I got a number of messages on my WhatsApp that want me to ask you about it. You met the Prime Minister. He's also endorsed the book. There are rumors that you gave him a list of reforms that are needed to be done in the next 5-6 years. What was that meeting about? And I'm going to come to you later to discuss that particular encounter. And of course, the rise of the Rajasic nation, and you're handing over a copy of that book to him. But let me first turn to Mr. Debroy. So, Debroy, you make an interesting proposition in your contribution. You suggest a younger India will be in power by 2030, in the next decade. You suggest the legislative legacy would be cleaned up by 2035. Socialism would have been rejected. A new entrepreneurial class will be driving India. And many of the constitutional pressures that hold us back would have been eased. Can you elaborate on what makes you believe this is likely to be the direction?
Thank you, Samir, and thanks to Gautam for having given me the opportunity to write this essay, and thanks to Amish also for hosting this particular event. Thanks to all the other contributors for having put together a very, very rich volume. I think let me start with the comment that you made initially, Samir, that we are still in the midst of a COVID pandemic. We are still in the midst of a problem that is plaguing the entire world. We are still in the midst of a growth slowdown that had happened. Unfortunately, therefore, we tend to get fixated by what is immediate, what's in the midst of us right now. But whenever one is talking about a book like this, one tries to transcend what is the immediate trigger and look at longer term trends. It is not very different, I would say, from the SDGs, which also have a timeline of 2030. Quite patently, COVID has pushed back the timeline for the SDGs beyond 2030. But nonetheless, as trends, the SDGs remain, and exactly similarly, the trends in this book, including in my essay, also remain, although it's perfectly possible that we are no longer talking about 2030, we are probably talking about 2035, because 2 years have been taken away because of the pandemic. So far as the entrepreneurial class is concerned, entrepreneurship has been palpably blooming in India since 1991. The generation, and depends a little bit on what you mean by entrepreneur, what you mean by enterprise. The classic economist definition of being an entrepreneur is someone who takes risks. There is a generation out there which has either been born after 1991 or certainly has grown up post 1991 being when the reforms happened, and we are in the third decade. This particular generation, however you choose to define it, is much more entrepreneurial. Of course, it depends in a very diverse and heterogeneous country like India, depends on where you live. I would quickly like to mention that increasingly the story of the last couple of decades has been of an integration of many villages that earlier were not integrated into the mainstream. And pre-COVID, they were also becoming entrepreneurial by whatever definition, because people were willing to take risks. They were no longer seeking to be employed by others. They were seeking to do things on their own. That automatically means your attitudes towards the state, defined as government, changes. You reprioritize, therefore reflecting the consensus that emerges in a country like ours, in an indirect democracy like ours. Constitution and parliament and executive reflect the wills of the people. There is a legality which I want to quickly mention, because that legality is important, but it is not all that important, and that legality is about the insertion of the word socialism in the preamble to the Constitution. Amending that, of course, is going to be much more difficult. Amending the Constitution at a certain point in time, the preamble in the mid-70s was very easy because no one discussed it in Parliament. Amending the Constitution now is going to be much more difficult, and removing technically the word socialist is going to be much more difficult. As a consequence of that, every political party in India under the Representation of People's Act has to say that it is a socialist party. But the point I'm making is not about the legality of changing the preamble, which of course also encounters the issue of the basic structure. The point I'm making is, in the churn that has been happening in India pre-COVID, and as I said, COVID I think is transient. We will get back to our normal trajectory sometime next calendar year. Pre-COVID, it is my view that given the churn that was going on, given the young India that was happening, people were questioning the meanings of terms like socialism, secularism, and democracy. Not trying to remove them, but trying to reinterpret them. One instance of democracy is what has happened post the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment. Enormous amount of churn, reinterpreting what does democracy mean. Exactly similarly, a questioning of what the word socialism means. Not necessarily removing it from the constitution, that's difficult as I said, but interpreting what it means. And the issue it boils down to is, does socialism mean that I must give everyone equal access to various so-called inputs? That's, I think, more or less a given. But does it mean that everyone must have the same outcomes? I don't think that is the consensus across younger India. Younger India would certainly like the former. I don't think young India insists that outcome should be the same for everyone, which is what redistribution of wealth as opposed to equal opportunities for creating wealth implies. That's exactly what I mean by saying a continued emphasis on reducing inequity, but a less of an emphasis on inequality, on reducing inequality as defined by distribution of something like incomes. Finally, the way people's attitudes change is almost exponential. By 2030, 2035, we'll be at a per capita income of $4,000 or thereabout. 1991, we were at $300. Of course, US dollars depends on the exchange rate. Today, it's just over 2,000, 2,200, let's say. But look at the way changes have happened. Look at the socio-economic transformation. Exactly similarly, because young people will step into positions of policy making, I think attitudes will change.
Let me ask you to perhaps elaborate another aspect, because you brought out the issue of inequality and inequity. Let me ask you on that. You have also argued that the inequality debates in India will really be dense and intense when we reach a per capita income of $20,000 per person. So we are still a bit away from the time when we should really be worrying about it. I would argue that we are seeing those debates already in place. We are seeing some bit of wealth creation. We are seeing a fair degree of wealth redistribution even today. And yet we are being enveloped by debates around inequality. Are we, in some sense, are Western debates implicating our public discussions on economics? Or do you think these are what keep our Squatteratis busy and the real India is thinking differently?
In any democracy, there will always be debates. People will always argue. That's fair enough. The question is what eventually happens after the debate. It is entirely true that many of the debates in India use arguments and data even from the West. It is an accepted principle that whenever a country goes through fast economic change, there is some increase in inequality of outcomes. It inevitably happens. Is that necessarily bad? I don't think so. The more important question is, given India's diversity, given India's diversity not only in terms of its geographical expanse, but in terms of the age profile of the population, there will be different points of view. Question is, on balance, what do we decide?
Mr. Debroy, I'm probably going to come back to you in a bit. Let me turn to Dr. Narlikar at this time. Amrita, you have posed a very interesting proposition for India in the coming days. you have suggested that India's most significant contribution to multilateralism is actually going to be the infusion of the real idea of values into debates. Now, I am a little bit of a skeptic when someone uses the term value. You know, the Europeans have been throwing the value debate on India forever, be it climate change, be it Afghanistan, be it any global geopolitical development, and we hear values being invoked. It's become rhetorical. So when you say that India is going to actually embed the idea of value in multilateralism, what do you mean by that?
Thank you, Samir. May I just start off by saying it's great to be here. I had tremendous fun writing the chapter that Gautam asked me to. So thanks for bringing us all together. And Amish, it's thank you for hosting this and bringing us together. Samir, you are spot on. Values seem to find some token reference nowadays. And then it goes back to doing business as usual with China, right? We hear a lot about values in Europe, and then then here comes business. Here's Volkswagen. Here's the big business. Let's go back to business as usual. Let me just say a little bit on why this is the case, and the reason why we keep seeing this Groundhog Day is because of a core assumption of the post-war multilateral system, and that assumption was that peace and prosperity were inextricably and positively linked. So through economic exchange, we all were supposed to get progressive convergence and even socialization. And this is indeed what seemed to be happening for almost 50 years until the China shock. The problem is that technocratic narratives do not recognize that the economic ties, those very same ties that were supposed to bind us all together into a Kantian peace, those very same ties in a world of closely integrated global value chains can be weaponized. They can be weaponized by systemic rivals. And so what you get in the Brussels bubble and the Geneva bubble are homilies. You get homilies to the rules-based system. You get platitudes on the rules-based system, on motherhood and apple pie. That's what's just missing, right? And what is really missing is a fundamental questioning of what is that rules-based system for? It's not an empty shell. What do those rules do? Is that system fit for purpose today? And what values underpin it? This takes me to the core of your question, Samir. India can play a major role in correcting this dissonance. It can do so by pushing for a fundamental reform of the system, which upholds not those same issues of labor standards and environmental standards that you were referring to and that Europe has indeed thrust upon most of the global South as if it's the only guardian of liberal values, right? But pushing for macro level values. If you get those macro level values right, labor standards, environmental standards, and so forth will follow. Those macro level values are democracy, pluralism, liberalism, rule of law, the values that define India as a state and are adopted in its culture as a civilization. Now, this is not always easy for India to do, not least because we have the European Union, we have the global northern players often behaving as if they are the sole guardians of these values. And India sometimes doesn't help itself. For example, it reacts with irritation, understandably so, to this narrative, and then allows itself to get pushed into a corner with China, for heaven's sake. For example, in the World Trade Organization debates. This is deeply troubling, of course, because in fact, India is very concerned about China in terms of geopolitics and geoeconomics. And so what could India be doing and what is it certainly capable of doing and what the world should be hoping for India to do is it should be distinguishing itself from China, flagging up its liberal credentials, working with allies, both from the global north and from the global south, to build a multilateralism that will be fit for purpose, which will uphold these values that India has always supported, and which will also be able to deal with a world of weaponized interdependence.
Amrita, you also make a political point in your essay, nationalism, around nationalism. You say that by 2030, we will see a healthy and confident Indian nationalism that has finally ensured that its Hindu majority is no longer marginalized while ensuring space for its large and small minorities to flourish on equal terms with the majority. In other words, you see in your essay unity. Some would argue we are watching aggressive slivers of the opposite today in our public sphere, in our political discussions. What gives you confidence that your formulation for the future is likely to hold true?
It's interesting that you saw that as optimism, Samir. I don't think I was being optimistic or pessimistic. I was pointing to one of the key risks that could stop India from playing that impressive global role. And that risk, indeed, like you point out right now, it is indeed an insular, aggressive form of extreme nationalism. And that risk is serious. It's not only in India that it's serious, it's also serious in the United States, as we saw in January. It's serious in parts of Europe. It's very serious in different parts of the world, right? This is not an India-specific problem. But you did say optimistic, so let me try and be optimistic now, and let me do this in the following way. There are some powerful unifying forces across different religious traditions in India, be it the Bhakti movement, be it Sufism, so on and so forth. And we have seen Hinduism being attacked frequently in recent years by what Gautam talks about in his book as the woke folks. And here it's really important to remember that Hinduism also has some remarkably liberal traditions, which should be asserted and can be made active use of. So, for example, the idea of Atmavat Sarva Bhuteshu Yah Pashyati Sah Panditaha. He who looks upon the world, upon all creatures as he looks upon himself, he is the truly wise one. Now, that's a variant of liberalism that is more liberal than many Western philosophers would accept. It offers a worldview that is not anthropocentric. Mr. Debroy was talking about the pandemic, right? And one of the lessons that we can all take away from the pandemic is nature needs to be respected. And here's a culture, here are Hindu traditions which are telling us that we have a vision of human rights that are not human only, right? These are very powerful traditions. And if our leaders and our people were to work with these wonderful traditions, we would indeed have a polity where all Indians can be proud of their nation.
So, Amrita, just to clarify, I don't think you were being optimistic. I, in some of my own writings, have clearly outlined that our pluralism and secularism is not through a constitution, but through a lived reality of multiple thousands of years. So this has been honed into our existence. It is not something that is acquired through a legislation. But we can have a debate on that at another forum. But this is very interesting, Amrita. Values as well as a plural nationalism that is likely to perhaps find space in the future. Manish, you are the jobs man. You are the one who's going to give jobs to everyone. We have this thriving, young, aspirational demographic, the woke folks, as Manish calls it, as Gautam calls it, the post 1991 generation, as Mr. Debroy outlined in his interventions. We will. Your premise seems to be that India is going to see a real rise, a radical rise in productivity. Not only of firms and institutions, but also of people. And you suggest that it is not jobs that's the problem, but wages that is the challenge. And perhaps embedded in that, in your assertions, is a very direct suggestion on the formalization of employment processes. Now, how do you tie this up in terms of radical rise in productivity and, of course, accompanying wages, but yet jobs for all or opportunities for all? How do they square up?
See, unemployment has been between 4 and 9% since 1947. That is because of three painful or shameful labor shock absorbers, if you want to call them. 42% of our labor force works in agriculture. It only generates 14-15% of GDP. 50% of our labor is self-employed. It's not self-employed, it's self-exploiting. And labor force participation, particularly among women, has declined. So by any Western standard, which is what some of the lens people look at, our unemployment is been fine for many years. But the problem is poverty. And so employed poverty is a really different problem than unemployment. And employed poverty, and only the poor rich can afford to be unemployed. So I say that the wages problem has come from this low productivity regions, low productivity sectors, low productivity firms, and low productivity individuals. I live in Karnataka. My parents live in UP. Both states have the same GDP. We do it with 1/4 the number of people. So clearly, regions is a problem. Firms, we know that there's a 25 times difference in productivity between the biggest and smallest manufacturing firms in India. Obviously, sectors, IT is a rounding error. It's only 0.8% of India's labor force writes code, but it generates 8% of GDP. And obviously, individuals, a kid the same age with exactly the same job description, I would pay 4 times difference in salary. So even today, so I would submit that if you think the problem is jobs, you'll throw money from helicopters, you'll mandate a 3-day work week, you'll take away people's shovels and give them spoons to dig with, because you don't really care about productivity, which is what the solution has been for decades. But if you care about wages, you will think about formalization, urbanization, industrialization, financialization, and human capital, which are the 5 vectors we've tried to pursue in the last sort of few years. And formalization becomes really important because it's not about big versus small. It's about formal enterprises are more productive than informal enterprises. And what is informality? I mean, beyond a point, it's a sense of humor about the rule of law. If you want to have a sense of humor, how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced, this is how India works. We have to move from deals to rules. So I would submit formalization of our enterprises, individual sectors that we have undertaken quite painfully. There has been short-term pain for long-term gain. Is absolutely a down payment we have made, and we will see the benefits by 2030.
Manish, can I just ask you a second part to that formalization challenge? Increasingly, we are seeing that the attributes of formalization is what the world is focusing on. So social protection, basic income, insurances, direct benefit transfers, the right to life and lifeline existence is guaranteed through certain provisions, and opportunities and entrepreneurship takes you to the next stage of engagement with the economic sector. Should India and Indian government be focusing on delivering the attributes, or do we want to go back to the formal economy, formal employment ideals that were defined in the 60s and 70s, and Mr. Debroy knows about them? So should we be embracing the gig structures that already exist and providing attributes of formality on it, or should we really be working to create those formal structures that you suggest?
I really take the perspective not of formal employees, but formal employers, right? India has 63 million enterprises, 12 million don't have an office, 12 million work from home, only 12 million pay GST. There are only 22,500 companies in India with a paid up capital of more than $1.5 million. Now, this is not cultural. Informality is not something we love. The regulatory cholesterol, the 67,000 compliances, the 6,700 filings. Gautam and one of my colleagues, Rishi, have done a lot of work on this. Traditionally, Indian entrepreneurs concluded that the benefits of formality were lower than the costs of formality. And therefore, you had that much informality. I think with GST, with a lot of new changes, I think many entrepreneurs are concluding that the benefits of formality are starting to approach are starting to be higher than the costs of formality. And I think that formality super cycle, we need a lot more regulatory cholesterol reduction, which we're working on. But I think that formalization super cycle is the compounding which just never happened after independence, because either the excessive regulatory cholesterol created a sense of humor about the law, or just the the 1955 Avadi resolution just kneecapped entrepreneurs, handicapped capital markets, and just basically our labor got handicapped without capital and our capital got handicapped without labor. So I just say that, the formalization, you can frame it from the perspective of employees, but I at least have been framing it from the perspective of employers.
Okay. So you also mentioned the term regulatory cholesterol, again a favorite of yours, and Gautam invokes it many times. Your essay suggests that by 2030 we would have reduced or eliminated it. What gives you hope?
Well, because there are only three interventions the government can do: fiscal policy, monetary policy, and structural. If fiscal deficits could make countries rich, then no country would be poor. So we're running out of that. Monetary policy is sort of, at least in my mind, it's a placebo or a painkiller, or maybe not even that in the long run. I think we have now tried a lot of fiscal and monetary policy. And so we've now reached the conclusion that formalization, urbanization, industrialization, financialization, and human capital are all that work. And an important element and thread running through all of them, which now most state chief ministers, many central government ministries recognize, that maybe this regulatory cholesterol got excessive. And it's frankly the lowest hanging fruit in reform, right? I mean, you have capacity building reforms which take time, you have institutional reforms which take even longer. But flick of pen reforms is really what regulatory cholesterol is about. And I think there's 67,500 flick of pen reforms just waiting for a pen to be flicked. And I think there is appetite about it. And I think there's enough consensus around it too.
I'll come to Mr. Debroy on the flick of the pen reforms Manish is referring to, and I would like to know what's the possibility of the pen flicking more often in the coming decade in India to unleash the power of the entrepreneurial class that you described, Mr. Debroy. A quick intervention for you before I turn to Monika.
Well, I think you should have turned to Monika first, but in any case, before the quick intervention, in terms of expectations on the part of the government, expectations on the part of the government are either, particularly union government, they're either on the tax side or they're on the expenditure side. One of the things that's clearly happening, we may have complaints about GST, what's happening to the direct tax code, but so far as the direction is concerned, both on expenditure and on taxes, by 2030, including devolution, union to state, it should be stable. It should stabilize. So therefore, expectations on the part of the government will cease to be fiscal. They will therefore perforce become what Manish just referred to as structure. Now, those compliances that Manish mentioned, the figures, they're primarily about labor. And much of the regulatory cholesterol that one is talking about is about factor markets, which are primarily and sometimes exclusively in the domain of the states under the 7th schedule. What I think will happen, or at least the pressures will mount for it to happen, is a revamping of the 7th schedule. Despite the kind of discussions and debates they alluded to, which will continue to happen, I'm optimistic that at some point we will have a consensus that we need to decentralize, we need to decide which layer of government, not just government per se. And this is a trend that will begin to be accentuated once we are beyond this temporary slowdown.
Thank you, Mr. Debroy. Monika, let me turn to you. I think you have perhaps written what I would argue, and I was telling Gautam this, is the most important aspect and perhaps the underspoken aspect of a nation's national power, its savings, and to make the savings investable, to make them productive, and to make them work for national priorities and objectives. And in that sense, you point out that the saving banks in our phones will become the investment bank of the 2020s. All of us, including the poor, have taken to phone banking. That's a trend that we have seen over the last decade. Can you show us what phone investing in 2020s will look like? And how is this going to change the way the nation meets its objectives.
Right. Thanks, Samir. Thank you so much. And this is a continuing theme of financialization, formalization. But I have to start with a very small story. So this is 2009. I'm consulting with the Ministry of Finance, attached with the Swaroop Committee. We're doing a report. And we invite Nandan Nilekani to help us think through some areas in consumer protection and financial literacy. He walks in, he understands the problem, he picks up a marker, and this is 2009, and he draws a screen. Mobile phones were still Blackberries in 2009. We didn't have smartphones. He draws the screen with all the tabs that we are seeing today, where all of this was on one screen. Saving, your investing, your insurances, with wafer thin costs. It was seamless, it was real time. I can just say that we are sort of living a part of that dream right now, and we're about halfway there. The one thing that he didn't talk about was earning. How do you put that earning button and how do you harvest data? Now with account aggregators in place, in a few years, Indians hopefully will be able to harvest our own digital exhaust rather than leaving it to be harvested by big tech. But the point actually that I want to make here, Samir, is that we, as the haves in this whole story, we are already experiencing mobile money investing. We're already halfway there. But what will this mean in this decade for the farmer, for the agri sector? Take the case of an apple orchard owner, a farmer in Himachal. Access to finance, it's not even access to customized finance. Access to finance to him or her is a problem. If we can do this with this single screen, not only does she have access to customized finance, he gets savings, investing, credit, and risk mitigation. So imagine there's a flash flood and half of his orchard goes away. He pulls his mobile out, files for a claim. The claim management company already had a drone out there because they heard there was a flash flood. They already had the data and they could verify that one of their clients had their orchard half swept away. In 2 days, his phone goes beep, 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 and the insurance money is actually credited to his account. So it sounds like utopia today because of the mess in the way that insurance in agriculture runs and the problems with the insurance firms. But this is what the marriage of finance, technology, and the young entrepreneurs of India, all the millennials and the Gen Zs, that marriage, what it will bring actually in terms of getting all of these services on our phones is something I think we will see. The challenge, according to me, is not either the technology or the enterprise. I mean, you should hear of some of the stories of the fintech, the insurtech, what they're doing with various parts of technology and trying to really stitch this together. Again, it's coming back to Manish's point of the regulatory cholesterol, of the old thought. The problem is really turf issues within the financial sector regulators, the monopoly mindset of the regulators. What you actually need is a seamless interface for the individual. Rather than having to choose regulators, they should be thinking of the service that financial product gives to us. So the challenge really is on getting the policymakers and the regulators to see the world from the point of view of the individual and then allow that interface to happen. And I'm actually very hopeful that in the next decade, we will see this dream come true, Samir.
Monika, you also mentioned that digital money will increase the velocity of money itself and will bring around greater transparency and accountability in the financial system. Why do you arrive at this conclusion? You see these number of new service providers crop up, and you perhaps could also reach a situation of a regulatory mess or incoherence when you have multiple small service providers giving you part of the service that you require. Why do you believe that first it's faster money and second it is more accountable?
Right. So, Samir, before actually I get to this whole digital money and what it's doing, I want to just quickly mark this journey, this incredible journey that India has had, which has happened over the last decade, which we are taking for granted. We are actually complaining of a possible regulatory mess, of possible too many competing services on our phone to trundle money around. But I just look at, I mean, we know this example, a security guard in Mumbai trying to send his money to his village in Bihar 10 years ago. It would have taken him half a day of leave to go to the post office or bank. 5% would have been the cost. It would have taken a week, 10 days for that money to reach. Some amount of appreciation money might have to be given to the person delivering, the postman or whoever. Today, he's spoiled for choice. It's a couple of apps in his phone which he taps, and the money seamlessly, real time, low cost goes to the family. And this has happened because the country has taken the road which is of building a digital public utility, which means the infrastructure is public. You can run your private cars on this road. So there is a road, belongs to the public, but you can run your private cars on it. Bhim really was a proof of concept because no one thought it would work. But now you have Google Pay, you have Phone Pay, you have WhatsApp Pay. All of those are actually just state of the art payment systems, which we have got as a nation literally on a platter. We have to acknowledge the role played by the government, RBI, iSpirit, the volunteers out of Bangalore who made this possible. And it really amuses me to see people talking about cryptocurrency in India as this godsend. So you can send money here and there. You know, it's okay for the Americans to talk because their banking system is outdated, their payment system is geriatric. We don't need that. We can think of that as an asset class, if at all. But in terms of a payment system, we don't really need cryptocurrency. So the other things of overseas transaction is a totally different story. Now I'll come to your point about transparency, accountability. Digital money leaves an exhaust. It has a trace. You can track both corruption, terror financing, origination, destination of that money. Just the linking of bank accounts, phone, Aadhaar to the direct benefit transfers has exposed the entire rotten pipeline. We've understood how many ghost beneficiaries were there. So as we use this more and more, we are understanding that the push against formalization, the push against digitization has really come from vested interests, people who don't want really this transparency. What is the problem with linking your bank account with Aadhaar? So that really has been the resistance. So when you see the problems in getting real estate reforms going, we got a regulator in 2019, right? And that regulator is also defunct. It's differs state to state because real estate remains the last stump of unaccounted money in India. So yes, of course, you need digital money. It's faster, safer, real time, lower cost, and it shines this light of transparency on the transactions as they happen. So for me, I think this has been one of the biggest things to happen in India. And we should really be sort of thinking ahead with it in terms of a soft export to other countries rather than trying to question whether this is a problem or not. Samir.
Manish, would you like to come in on this? Because this is something that implicates perhaps a segment of your efforts as well. And are you seeing this change significantly the way you were approaching your particular sector in domain? Manish, that was to you.
I mean, I think that, India being a world leader in real-time payments, 3 billion payments last month, our target was 1 billion payments. We will reach 1 billion payments a day. I mean, I think that this is absolutely remarkable what has happened in payments in India. I think the 50% credit to GDP ratio, the financialization, that we've been stuck in, that needs a different level of structural sort of change. We need more banks. We need to fix government banks. We need to fix private banks. We need to stop distinguishing between banks and non-banks. We need to fix a little bit in regulation supervision, all of which I think is WIP. So I would say that the financialization super cycle is very complementary to the formalization super cycle. I mean, I think the financial super cycle in payments is further ahead than what it is in credit. But I think that both of them are not only mutually reinforcing, but I think both of them are on their way. Now, again, you could talk about regulatory cholesterol in financialization, but these things are all WIP and accelerating.
Thank you, Manish. So we move to the final segment with Amish, and I will, of course, also invite Amrita in for her thoughts on what Manish shares with us. Manish, you have asserted that ancient India will drive modern Bharat. Now, explain that to the viewers and certainly to me. I mean, I read the essay. Now, for the benefit of all, what does this really mean in practical terms?
You know, and in fact, I'll restate a point that you made, which in fact, even I've written in various articles, that India is not a liberal country because of a constitution that was bequeathed to us in 1950. No, we are liberal because our civilization is liberal. And our civilization has been liberal for thousands of years. India is the only pre-modern land where sub-Saharan Africans came as immigrants and rose to become kings by the dint of their own merit, the Siddhi Maharajas, and they converted to Hinduism or Islam, but they continued with many of their ancient practices. This was 600 years ago. The Zoroastrians, when they were attacked by Arabs, the oldest Israelis, when their temple was destroyed by the Romans. India has always been a liberal, open society. It's not because of a constitution in 1950 which made us liberal. Now, there's a certain part of the elite which is very westernized in its approach. I think that one sees in part of the way the economy is managed as well. We have first world regulations or controls on doing things in an economy which is still third world. First world labor regulations, which what in effect does is reduces unemployment, because our there is a segment of our elite which actually believes they're living in New York or London, and which actually is where many of the dissonances emerge. If we realize that many of our solutions is actually in our own land, in our own traditions, we will find it much easier to make the case. Like, for example, if you have to fight for the rights of women, what some of our westernized elite used to do is give us American or British examples which have no relevance to the real India, which will connect only to some parts of South Mumbai or Little Delhi or maybe a few big cities. But if you make the same case by using our ancient traditions, the Rig Veda, our most ancient scripture, has hymns written by women rishikas. We had the equivalent of women prophets and messiahs. There's no other culture I'm aware of which had that, right? If you use that example, then the real India will listen to you a lot more. If you want to speak of LGBT rights rather than using European examples, which again have no connect to the real India, you can use the words of Lord Ram from Ramcharitmanas. For transgender rights, you can use the example of the founder of the Chandravanshi line of rulers. Lord Krishna was a Chandravanshi. The founder was a transgender, Ila, right? You use examples like this, it will connect to the real India a lot more. So what I mean is that the elite may not, the part of the westernized elite may not change its view, but the real India will rise and start pushing its view in any case. And I think that the way our ancient traditions are, uh, we can have, we can mitigate against um, the risk of the excesses of liberalism. The Western world is really showing to us what the problem with that is. You of course want women's rights. You of course want LGBT rights. You of course want minorities' rights, but you don't want the breakdown of family, the breakdown of community structures, the breakdown of traditions that you have in the West. And we can see the epidemic of loneliness. We can see the chaos in their society, in Western societies. It's the first time that I'm actually living in a Western society. I've traveled a lot abroad, but I've always lived in India. And in many cases, I have to admit, I'm actually worried about Western society. and the problems that have emerged due to the breakdown of family, of traditions, of community. Can we have both? Can we have liberalism and a strong family community structure? Ancient India actually makes that apparently impossible, uh, balance. Ancient India makes it possible. Our ancestors did it. We can do it again.
What I found interesting is that you also suggest that India in the 2020s, in the next decade, will excavate into our deeper selves and seek solutions to domestic and world problems there. Of course, I can immediately connect with climate change as being one of the world problems which require us to look deeper into our own histories. But you also suggest that this process of looking inwards for discovering pathways is also India's source of soft power. Can you elaborate on that?
Look, it's like this. I will speak of climate change as well, on this. But I think one of the key strengths of India, which most other countries in the world don't have because of a tide of history of the last 2000 years. Look, India is the only pre-Bronze Age civilization that is still alive. Every other pre-Bronze Age civilization has been wiped out, most of them violently, right? What does that imply? It means that India, at its core, does not believe that there is only one truth, which, if you don't believe in, you will burn in hell for eternity. We, at a fundamental level, we actually don't believe in that. And that's what opens the path for liberalism. Most other countries in the world, because of a tide of history of the last 2000 years, believe that there is only one truth. Even the liberals, the so-called anti-religious liberals in the West, also actually come from the concept of one truth, right? That their position of liberalism is true liberalism, and the rest of us, pagans, heathens, whatever they want to call us, third world, we have to fall in line with their version of liberalism. How's that different from extremism? That's not liberalism, so if someone will say that you have to that accepting transgender rights means, I'm using a silly example, but accepting transgender rights means I have to declare my pronouns, which, why, that's a limitation of your English language. It's not so in Sanskrit is the only ancient language which actually had a third gender, right? It's there. Even Western liberalism still comes from a one truth paradigm, and one truth by its very nature has extremism in its DNA, because they simply cannot accept that someone else has a right to their truth, right? You see that in Western media, for example. They just believe that their approach to liberal democracy is the approach, and they will make rankings and judge everyone else. And if we don't follow their rankings, then we have to be sent to purgatory or hell or whatever. It's actually the same one truth concepts, just has a liberal veneer on it. India does not follow that, and so India can perhaps actually maybe evangelize is a very loaded word, but may perhaps market what true liberalism can be, which brings me into to climate change. Look, the way I see it, this is of course a burning issue, right? But climate change has got into that same one truth paradigm, that those who believe in climate change actually want to look down on those who don't believe in climate change, and they will judge them, and how dare you not believe in what I am saying is the truth, right? That's not the way you make allies. That's not the way you can get things done, right? uh, all that you do with that is create opposition, right? And you will have to move either into a blasphemy paradigm or that's not going to work. But if you go with the Indian approach, like our way of the way we approach climate change, I mean, India is the only country, from what I had read in the briefing, the only country which has actually met its
Paris
Paris,
goals.
close to meeting its Paris goals. We in effect have a carbon tax on petrol. Many Western countries don't have it, right? There are many who see that as an unfair tax. I see it as a carbon tax. It's disincentivizing petrol and diesel. Good. We should incentivize more cleaner fuels. Uh, we are a culture which sees nature as a goddess to be worshipped. not as a resource to be exploited. It's easier for a politician to make the case for climate change, and if you don't come from the perspective that I am morally superior because I support the climate cause, you can perhaps have a conversation which will work. I mean, if you tell a climate skeptic that, look, if you buy a car, you take an insurance policy, right, on it. I mean, there's no guarantee that you're going to have an accident. In fact, 99.5% you'll probably not have an accident. You still take an insurance policy because just in case an accident happens, you want yourself covered. It's the same thing with climate change, right? Maybe the scientists are right, maybe the scientists are wrong, maybe the probability is not more than 50%, but just in case they are right, the cost to all of us, not just in terms of money, in terms of sheer lives, are so high. Shouldn't we take an insurance policy? Things that can be done for a reasonable cost. Now, this kind of space for debating opens up when you don't see yourself as morally superior just because you hold a point of view. That is the key, I think, secret sauce that India brings to the table. We don't believe in one truth. We don't believe in moral superiority, moral inferiority. We don't have those concepts.
Thanks, Amish. I think that's a very interesting proposition. The India way could actually be where the world meets in its disagreements. Amrita, the Indian soft power proposition in the world today, sitting in Hamburg, beautiful city of Hamburg, how is that engaged with today in that part of the world?
Well, there are two reactions to that. On the one hand, there's a lot of stereotyping about India, which are all subject to all the time, right? I mean, in a number of talks that I've given on India here, where I've been asked, but you must really know about violence against women because you must suffer it, right? And so what is it like in India? Well, actually, I'm not a specialist on gender violence. Right. And so I react against that stereotyping. And that is deeply frustrating. And this is true in Europe, it's true in a lot of different countries. I'll add to the other side, which I think we need to be making more of, is some of our universalism, right? And so I see the point about the India way, but that I don't want us to go down that rabbit hole of the Asian way. Right? Because there are things in the India way which are genuinely universal about humankind and all creatures, right? And so, for example, and I think and my Indian politicians can make more of this domestically and internationally. That takes me to the issue of alliances, coalitions, partners, friends, right? And so, for example, RCEP, India has done, India stayed out of it. It got a lot of criticism. My view on this is it was smart to stay out of RCEP, right? Very smart. But we can't just stop there. We need to be making closer trade agreements, which are not, which allow us to bring shorter supply chains with allies that we can trust in strategic products. Now, to build that, we need to go beyond that very narrow labor standards, environmental standard debates, and talk about more universal values, right? So let's use some of our ancient values to really appeal to friends and allies.
Thanks, Amrita. I want to quickly bring in Gautam to have the final word in this particular discussion. We've had fantastic 75 minutes of conversations this evening. But Gautam, perhaps you can respond to my question that I posed to you at the beginning of the discussion, and perhaps also comment on what you heard from all your fabulous authors this evening. So Gautam, you have the final word, and then I'll hand it to Amish to close, because he's actually wearing two hats today. He's a speaker, but he's also the host. So he will have the final word this evening. But Gautam, over to you first for your thoughts as we close this discussion.
Yeah, so I was, of course, listening very carefully, and I think there are at least 5 papers and maybe a book that can come out of just this 75 minutes that you gave us. I think it's a rethink of the way we look at ourselves, and through us, the world. Whenever I travel abroad, whenever bookshelves is my natural habitat. I go buy books, and you have entire shelves on China, the China way, the red, the party, the economy, how China will take over US. The whole shelf is full of China. And when you look for an Indian book, I mean, somewhere at the corner, it lies among the lower shelves. Last 3 years, I've been noticing, and all of us are here are global travelers. You would have noticed, as I certainly have, that the India books are rising in the shelves. They are making a space for themselves. So I believe these Indian ideas, I think the world wants to know what India is all about in all there is, by the way, this whole thing about the idea of India, I disagree with. I think there are 1.3 billion ideas of India. And I find it very silly to say that, okay, here's the definitive book and this is India. Or even I would critique myself, India 2030, here it is and go for it. I mean, let's be humble about it. These are some of the ideas written by leaders, 6 of whom are sitting here. But there could be an alternative reality and which will be equally cogent, equally powerful. So I think the first thing is that in terms of the ideas, I can see India moving forward. Second thing, and it came out from some discussions here, is that, India is going to be the world's 3rd largest economy within this decade. Do we really want to follow? This is an open question, and I think we need to discuss this. I think Bibek and Manish particularly. Do we need to follow Basel norms for a banking sector that has not seen any major implosion, like the 2008 crisis or the earlier banking scam? There have been so many banks that have gone out of business. India's banking structure is fairly robust. Do we need to import these norms, these thoughts, these ideas from failing institutions? Do we need to increase our footprint and influence those changes? I don't know. So as the world's so far we've been acceptors or takers of all these issues. Whatever the West said, we followed. But as a 3rd largest economy, I think we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our country to redefine certain norms. Amrita mentioned WTO, Amish talked about cultural engagements, Monika talked about money. We are certainly on the cutting edge, but somehow we are again there. We seem to be takers rather than enactors of new things. Look at LIBOR. Do our interest rates or the global interest rates need to be benchmarked to LIBOR? I could go on. The gold, we are the world's largest gold consumers, and our carat, the way gold is measured abroad. Are we ready to accept this anymore as the world's 3rd largest economy? That is one stream of thought that came to me. And I think the answers, I don't want to get into a sectoral discussion here because my premise is more philosophical and spiritual. I think the young India that's coming up, youth has its power. Youth is generally more Rajasic. Youth gives you a natural advantage. So we keep talking about demographic dividend, demographic benefit, demographic growth, etc. It's true. We just need to harness that. For instance, in what Manish said about our regulatory cholesterol, just harness those energies rather than smothering them. He talked about productivity. I mean, our agriculture is among the lowest in the world. Our manufacturing productivity is among the lowest in the world. I think the structures that we have built around these issues, and when you try to bring change, the entrenched people, who I would call tamasic, don't want that change and they prevent it. So I think these are the battles that we will be fighting over this decade. But I think Rajas will win. Let me conclude by, I just want to, I had picked up a very nice quote of Sri Aurobindo. There has been I mentioned this earlier, that there has been no nation, according to Sri Aurobindo, which has had which is a Sattvic nation. But I think in the evolution of nations, India could have that chance. And here's what Sri Aurobindo says. A Sattvic India, therefore, remains the objective. But we will have to pass through a Rajasic India to get there. I think that Rajas is a necessary step towards sattva. And I think that the way we are handling our rajas is more in tune with sattvic principles of peace, of equality, rather than the tamasic principles of grab, consume, devour. And to me, at this moment, despite all the noise outside, I think India seems to be on the right track. And my sense is the forecasts, the 20 forecasts in India 2030 are going to come true. Thanks, Samir.
Thank you, Gautam. Thank you, Gautam, for those thoughts. Let me thank Mr. Debroy, Monika, Amrita, and Manish for their contributions, and hand it to our host, Amish Tripathi, who will have the final word. Amish, over to you.
Thanks, Samir. Thanks for hosting a wonderful conversation with truly a stellar star cast of thinkers, and unfortunately, I was also added to it. It's a wonderful discussion, and I think what Gautam said at the end, that yes, there are many ideas of India. We are a culture of an entire library, not just one book. And may all those ideas prosper. If one has to kind of distill Indian thought into one word, perhaps the word that can aspire to capture it is balance, right? That not so violent that you cause chaos, but not so non-violent that you can't defend yourself. Not so money loving that actually you destroy everything else, but not so money hating that actually you just remain mired in poverty. We have to try and aspire for that balance in every aspect. If we can do that, we'll truly create a wonderful nation. And the sheer scale of India is such, 1.4 billion people, a fifth of humanity. We can change the entire world just because of our sheer scale. The only nation which matches up to this is China in scale, and China and India are perhaps among the few civilizational states. We're not a nation state; we're a civilizational state. We will have many ideas of India, and I'm delighted that Nehru Center hosted a few ideas among them on this platform. Thank you so much, Samir, for hosting this so well. Thank you so much, Vivek, Manish, Amrita, Monika, Gautam, my friend. A fantastic book put together with these wonderful thinkers, and a fantastic discussion here. I hope all of you enjoyed it, and do share this this program with all your friends. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.